General Motors purchased Cadillac in 1909, and for many decades subsequent to that, Cadillac churned out amazingly styled, beautifully executed, mechanically advanced vehicles. Among other vehicles that typify Cadillac excellence are the late 1940s sedanette coupes, the 1959 Cadillac model lineup, the 1960 lineup, the 1965 cleanly styled in the vein of the 1961 Continental Cadillac lineup, and the 1967 Eldorado. But at some point in the late 1970s into the early 1980s, Cadillac really started to go downhill relatively quickly. And there really were a couple major decisions that General Motors made that set the division along this path. The first was the introduction of the Oldsmobile 5.7-liter V8 diesel engine as an optional engine in the 1978 Seville, an otherwise excellent car that was highly styled and a home run in terms of setting a new trend in downsizing vehicles and charging premium prices for them, at least new in terms of the domestic auto industry market. In 1980, Cadillac made that 5.7-liter diesel engine standard on the Seville. You could get a no-cost 6-liter Cadillac 368 cubic inch V8 if you so wanted, but the diesel was standard equipment. And let's just say that this diesel was not anything to write home about. It was rather crude and unrefined, stinky, noisy, although if you were driving the vehicle from the inside, you didn't hear all that much. It was well insulated from inside the cabin, but you wouldn't want to start it up at your friend's house and drive away. It was one of those embarrassing experiences, shall we say. However bad that decision was to make that Oldsmobile 5.7-liter V8 diesel standard in the 1980 Seville, it didn't quite compare to another decision that really set Cadillac back decades in terms of its reputation and also angered its clientele. And that was to install the HT 4100 engine across the lineup in 1982. Now, in 1982, Cadillac was still producing huge, enormous, full-size vehicles. The DeVille, the Fleetwood, the Eldorado, and the Seville were all vehicles that were weighing in the upper 3,000-pound range to 4,000-plus pounds, and all had previously come equipped with a relatively reliable Cadillac 368 cubic inch V8 in the 1980 model year. And in 1981, yes, Cadillac did have the V864, which was a cylinder deactivation system that was included with the 368 cubic inch V8 that did indeed have some issues. That was a one-year-only feature, by the way, on passenger vehicles, although the V864 did soldier on for another year in factory limousines. But the V864, while it certainly had its challenges, was quite reliable if an owner simply deactivated the cylinder deactivation. However, the 1982 introduction of the HT 4100 engine into Cadillac's lineup was something that proved absolutely disastrous for the division. It was done really to help General Motors achieve corporate average fuel economy standards, which mandated that auto companies had to have a corporate fleet average fuel economy of 27 plus miles per gallon by the late 1980s. You can imagine that in 3,900 to 4,000 pound cars, it was quite difficult to achieve good fuel economy. And I'm sure that some of the rationale for installing the HT 4100 engine in these very large vehicles was that the engine weighed significantly less than the outgoing 6-liter Cadillac V8, and so the horsepower to weight ratio difference really wasn't that great. In fact, when installed in 1980 and 1981 Cadillacs, the 368 cubic inch V8 made between 140 and 150 horsepower depending on the model year and application. It really wasn't all that powerful. It did produce around 265 to 270 foot-pounds of torque, though, which was quite considerable and plenty to move the vehicle around, despite these vehicles' curb weights, which were around 4,000 to 4,200 pounds, again, depending on application and model year. However, by 1982, the Cadillacs had cut some weight versus the 1981 model year, a couple hundred pounds versus that previous year. However, the HT 4100 engine only produced 125 horsepower in that 1982 model year. It would go up to 135 horsepower in 1983, but really didn't make much of a difference, those 10 extra horsepower. The big story, however, was that torque significantly changed from the outgoing 368 cubic inch V8, again, which made 265 to 270 foot-pounds of torque, and in 1982, the HT4100 could only muster 190 foot-pounds of torque. So in addition to being down on horsepower, the engine really just didn't have much torque to move these 4,000-pound vehicles with any sort of speed. In fact, 0 to 60 times from magazines during the era reported that it took about 15 to 16 plus seconds to accelerate your full-size Fleetwood Brougham, DeVille, Eldorado, or Seville when it was equipped with the HT4100 V8. So slow acceleration certainly didn't endear this engine to Cadillac's customers, who had really become accustomed to more than adequate performance from Cadillac V8s of yesteryear. As an example, imagine trading in your 1977 DeVille that had a 425 cubic inch V8 making anywhere between 180 and 195 horsepower. You got the fuel-injected version, and around 320 foot-pounds of torque for a 1982 DeVille that weighed little less than the 1977 model, but had horsepower of only 125 and torque of only 190 foot-pounds. That was certainly not something that customers were accustomed to. But the HT4100's woes go far beyond the horsepower output of the engine, for perhaps Cadillac could have survived this period if that engine were reliable. But the truth is that the HT4100 was the first from Cadillac in terms of aluminum block V8 engines. It was an aluminum block with cast iron cylinder liners and a cast iron head. And the intake manifold on these engines was aluminum as well. So imagine you have an engine with an aluminum intake manifold, cast iron heads, and an aluminum block. Aluminum and cast iron clearly have different rates of thermal expansion, so it didn't help that you had cast iron heads Siamese between an aluminum intake and an aluminum block, and trying to control the sealing between all those surfaces was something that the head gaskets and intake gaskets were just not up to the task in 1982, and particularly in the early years of the HT4100. Cadillac thus was forced to change its service manual procedures, mandating that customers change their engine coolant every year and using coolant seal supplement tabs that are effectively crushed walnut shells, so that in the event a leak started to occur, these walnut shells would basically form a clot, if you will, to block that potential hole off. This was a procedure that was used on a number of GM aluminum block engines, including early Northstars, and it did in fact work. However, it took some time before General Motors engineers wrote this into the official service procedures, and in the intervening years, a number of these Cadillac HT4100 V8s failed, and the failures were often quite catastrophic. It was pretty typical for the intake gaskets to blow. The car would then overheat, or the oil would be mixing with the antifreeze. It would cause then the head gaskets to blow, and because the oil and antifreeze had been mixed, it would then start eating up all of the wear surfaces inside the engine, including the camshafts and lifters and crankshaft. It was just a overall terrible debacle and nightmare for Cadillac. Cadillac did end up trying to stand behind the engine and extended the powertrain warranty to 5 years or 50,000 miles on these V8s, but the damage had already been done, and Cadillac actually stuck with the engine all the way through the 1985 model year, when it was finally placed in the vehicles in which it was originally designed to be used, the newly downsized transversely mounted engine and transmission Fleetwood and DeVille. Those vehicles were 600 to 700 pounds lighter than the previous DeVilles and Fleetwoods, and the 4100 was actually an adequate performer in those vehicles. And by 1985, Cadillac had made some changes to the engine, including changing its block design slightly so that it had more stiffening and was less resistant to warping. The engine would then continue on until the 1987 model year, when it was replaced in 1988 by the much improved and enlarged Cadillac 4.5-liter V8, which also gave those vehicles a boost in horsepower from around 125 to 155 horsepower. This engine got port fuel injection in 1990 and was enlarged for a final time in the 1991 model year to 4.9 liters and made 200 horsepower. What's amazing about the Cadillac 4.9 liter engine is that many would say it's one of the best Cadillac engines of that era, especially compared to the North Stars that often replaced the 4.9. But the 4.9 certainly started off as a troubled HT, which stood for high technology, by the way, 4100 V8 all the way back in 1982. And from at least my standpoint, there's really no other decision other than placing this HT 4100 in those full-size Cadillacs from 1982 all the way through to the 1985 model year that did more damage to Cadillac than that. It's one thing that they were significantly down on horsepower, but this engine really just was not ready for prime time, and the failure rate was so high that many customers swore off Cadillacs for the rest of their lives. Hope you enjoyed this spotlight on the HT 4100 V8. If you did, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you.